Hi, I'm Alexander Maxim from Utopian.io. Today we will continue our series about PHP. In this tutorial, we're going to complete the exceptions part, as we have learned from the errors and the base of the use of the exceptions. Today we will see try catch, creating a custom exception class, multiple exceptions, and set a top level exception handler. An handler exception automatically generates a fatal error. We will see later what it means to catch. It returns uncaught exception with message. Today we will see how to handle the exception and how to control this message. Let's start firstly with the try, throw, and catch. In order to catch an exception, it must first be launched. The problem is that we can't tell PHP that all the exceptions launched must be caught. It's up to us to tell it that we will try to carry out this, and if an exception is launched, then we will catch it. We will now place our instructions in a try block. This will be placed between a pair of braces. Who says block try also says block catch, because one doesn't go without the other. This catch block has a small particularity. Instead of placing catch followed directly by the two braces, we will have to specify between a pair of parentheses placed between catch and the opening brace. The type of exception to catch followed by a variable that will represent this exception. It's from it that will be able to recover the message or the error code thanks to the methods of the class. Let's see how it works. So in the try, throw, and catch, we will use a function, for example, check age, to check the age passed as parameter if this age less than 18. If this age less than 18, we will use throw new exception, and this is the message of the exception: your age must be greater than 18 to be displayed to the user. So I will try to apply or to execute this function correctly. If there is an error, if there is an exception in the function, I will apply the catch. So I will check if the age 2 is less than 18 or no. If it's true, it will return true, else it will throw new exception. So if we have an exception, we will ignore all these parts and we will apply the catch part. So we will use an object E from the class exception, because the class exception has some methods to return the exception, the line, the message, etc. So in the catch, I will use echo to print anything here, and I will use E, which is our object that we have created from the class exception, and we will use the get message, which is a function by default in the exception class to print the exception to the user. So we'll try something. If it's true, we'll apply it, we will execute it. If it's false, we will try to apply the catch, or we will apply the second way. If there is an exception, we will so we have two ways. We have the try if it's true, and the catch if it's false. And the message that will be displayed to the user is from here. The catch, I mean, the error is your age must be greater than 18 that we have entered here to this exception. So this object has this message, and we can form this message to be displayed to the user. Let's see a real example to understand the try and catch. So try, throw, and catch. I have the function check age. I will pass the age to this function and test this age. If it's less than 18, I will throw new exception. So I will try, and when we pass, for example, and I have your age is greater than 18, and if we have an error or an exception in the check age method, in the check age function, the PHP will execute the catch part and will ignore the try part, because firstly it will try to execute this function and these instructions, and if there is an error, it will execute the catch part. So it will test if the age is less than 18. I will throw a new exception using this message, your age must be greater than 18. Let's pass, for example, 17, and when we reload, we have from here, from the catch, so the execution is from the catch because we have this message, so the PHP has executed the catch and ignored the try because there is an error, there is an exception in the try. From here, from the catch, the error is your age must be greater than 18, which is the message that I have passed to the object that we have created from the exception class. This is the try, throw, and catch. After that, we have creating a custom exception class. As we have seen the try catch block, in this part we will see how to create a custom exception. As we have studied how to create a custom error for our site, for that we will create a class inherited from the class exception. We will use the inheritance. The concept of the inheritance is very known. We will learn it in the next tutorials. Since the class inherited from the old class exception, it takes by default all the methods or all the functions of the parent class, like the getLine, getFile, getMessage functions that we will use in our function. In this new class, you have to create a function to handle the exception. In the function, we can use the methods that I already mentioned. The example we will use to understand how to create a custom exception is the robot test, to test whether the user is a robot or not by the question and by the response. Let's apply this example to understand more. So creating a custom exception class, we have now the robot exception class inherited from the exception class, because always we use throw new exception, so the class is the exception, and when we use throw new exception, so we create an object from the exception class. When we use a class inherited from the exception class, we can use all the methods that the exception class contains. So we use this message to form a message to display to the user. We have in the robot exception a function which is public function error message. So when we have an error, we can call this function when we use an object from the robot exception. So when the robot exception inherited from the exception class has many methods like getFile, getLine, getMessage. We can use them because the robot exception is now soon for the exception class, and we will form a message in the error message function, and we will return it. So we will use the try catch block. If the response is not 8, so for example the question is 2 plus 3 equals to 5. If the response 4 plus 4 equals to 8, if the response is not 8, I will throw new. We have used throw new exception, but now we will use throw new robot exception. So we will create an object from the robot exception. So if it's true, we will do nothing. If it's false, if the response is not 8, I will throw a new exception, so it will ignore all this block and it will execute the catch block. Here we have the robot exception class. It's an object from the robot exception class. If you look here, we have in the catch we have exception object which is the exception. But here in creating a custom exception class, we will use robot exception at place of the exception class. And inside the robot exception or inside the object, we can call the error message function using the object and this format to call this function inside this object, and we will use echo to print the returned message. So inside the function, we will form a message to display to the user. This message is, for example, with this format, error in this file, because we have used the getFile method in this line, because we have used also the getLine message and the getLine function, and the get message to get our message that we have passed to this, for example, to this function, which is 6, the response here as parameter to the robot exception. And we have also, you must enter a correct number or anything. You can't do anything, you can't form your message to display to the user, but the concept is how to create a custom exception, a class, and how to use an object from this class, and how to call the function to return the message format from the developer or any user. Let's do an example to understand it. So we have the class robot exception extends from the exception. So when we use extends, so this class will get all the methods and all the variables in the exception class. Inside, I will use a function, public function error message. Inside, I will create a variable message, and I will form the message that I want to display to the user. Then I will return this message. For example, this message contains error in, and you have the break line, this file, the get file function in the line get line or on the line get line, and the response entered, which is the message that we will pass to the robot exception class here or object. Then I will try. If the response is not 8, I will throw new exception. Then I will pass the message, which is the response that the user entered, or anything here to be here in at place of the get message here. If there is an exception, it will apply or it will execute the catch block. So it will create an object from the robot exception, and it will call the error message function using this object. Let's reload and see the result, and we have error in this file, this line, and the response entered by the user is, and you must enter a correct number. So when we change the response to for example 2, let's reload, and we have the response entered to the user is, and the response. We can pass a message here to the user. For example, it's an error or something like that. When we reload, we have it's an error. So we can pass the anything here to the object or to this exception, and it will be as a message to this exception. After that, we have the multiple exceptions. If we have more than one condition, or we can say more than one exception, can we manage them? Simply, yes. PHP offers the mechanism of multiple exceptions. If we use the example of age, if the age is less than 18, we can trigger an exception. But also we have another condition, if the age is greater than 150. It's incredible. So we have to trigger another exception. So in the try, we're going to make two conditions. The first will trigger an exception, or will create an object of the class, for example, less exception, and the second one of the class greater exception. And we will have two catches, two classes and two different functions. It's a bit difficult to understand. Let's do an example to understand how to use multiple exceptions. So we have another class, valid number, for example. It's a class inherited from the exception class. Inside the exception class, we have, as I have mentioned, the function get message, get line, get file, etc. And here inside the valid number, we have the function error message to return a message to be displayed to the user. We can use all these functions because it's when a class inherited from another class, it can directly use the methods and the functions that the exception class contains. I will try, because we have two conditions, for example, the valid number, and if the first condition, if the user entered a valid integer number, and the second, if it's a valid integer number, if this number is less than 18 or not. So I will check if the filter var filter validates int. If it's false, I will throw new valid number, which is our class, and I will pass the number that the user entered as a message to this exception. And if it's true, I will apply the second condition. If the number is less than 18, I will throw a new exception not another class, it's the same class, the exception, and I will pass this message to the exception to be displayed to the user. Your number is less than 18. And here we have two catches. Catch number one, which is a valid number. The object is E. From the valid number, I will use echo E, and I will call the error message function, which is the function inside our class. If we use, for example, e.get or get message like here, we will get just the number. And when we use error message function, we will get the returned message from this function. And the second is from the exception. I will create an object. I will use echo to print the message that I have entered here. Let's see a real example to understand it. So we have the class, which is valid number. I will create a function inside this class. It extends from the exception class. I will create a message variable, and I will return it with this format. And I will use a number which is 17. So it will check if the number is integer, is true. It will check if the number is less than 18. It will throw a new exception. So we will get this message here because we have e get message. Let's reload and see the result, and we have your number is less than 18. If we enter some, for example, 19, we get nothing because we haven't an exception. And if we use 19s, for example, or anything, we'll get error in this file line. The response is entered by the user is 19s. You must enter a number. So we will apply the error message function inside the valid number class. And for example, if we use get message at place of calling the function, we'll get just the message that here I have passed to the valid number exception. So if I enter, for example, your the same here, but I will change just your number is not so your number is incorrect. Let's reload, and we have your number is incorrect at place of calling the function. But if we want to display a message formatted to tell the user in which file and in which line and the message, etc., you can't call this function inside this exception. This is how to use a multiple exception. After that, we have set a top level exception handler. To display a general form for all the exceptions, we must use the set exception handler method. As we have learned how to create a custom exception with inheritance of the class exception, now we will see how to form a message with just one function, like the set error handler. We must first create a function with a parameter, thus the exception, and in the exception we will use the functions to display the message, the line, etc. Before executing this function, we must use set exception handler to add this exception to the old ones, and we will use the throw new exception with a message to use it in the function. Let's firstly see how it works. So we are in the set exception handler. I will create a function, for example, form exception, and I will pass the message or the exception to this function. Then I will use echo to print the format to be returned to the user as an error message to be displayed in the browser. I will use set exception handler to set this exception to the exception class or to the old ones. Then I will check if something is false. For example, I will throw new exception and the message to be displayed to the user. The PHP will execute this function that we have created. So inside the function, for example, I will say, oops, your age must be greater than 18, for example, or anything. So I have thrown a new exception with this message, your age must be greater than 18. And inside the function, I will make the message in red color. And I can use get message, get line, get file, etc. So I will general form for the exceptions. Let's see the example to understand more. So I will use function, for example, age exception, and I will pass the exception as parameter. Then I will use oops, and here span with the color red, and I will use the exception passed as parameter with the get message to get the message that the user entered or the developer entered. And I have the age is 15, for example. I will set this function to the exceptions, and I will check if the age is less than 18. I will throw new exception with this message: your age must be greater than 18. Let's reload, and we have oops, your age must be greater than 18. If I say anything here, for example, error or anything, this message will be displayed here with this format. We can change here the format with, for example, the get line or anything. So we have exception get line. Let's reload, and we have oops, error 66, because the error is here in this line. Today we have learned the try, throw, and catch, creating a custom exception class, multiple exceptions, and set a top level exception handler.